thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. I was particularly struck, sir, by the way you said I led the first referendum in Scotland. That seemed to imply there was going to be a second. So I was very, I was very pleased with that indeed. I'm going to have to shorten that CV, otherwise I'll have to shorten my speeches, incidentally. But I'm delighted to be here, and delighted to talk to such a varied audience. My subject today is parity of esteem, culture and reconciliation. And although, as was said, I was First Minister of Scotland, I'm actually going to take as a case study of this Northern Ireland. You may wonder what the former First Minister of Scotland is doing talking about Northern Ireland. Well, Northern Ireland and Scotland are, well, in the old phrase, are the blood of our blood and the bone of our bone. They are two very, very intricately connected societies just across a small channel of water, but also through history, through culture, and a whole variety of other things. There is the strongest bond imaginable between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And therefore, because the two societies have developed in different ways, it's instructive to look at some of the reasons why, and also to look at the small contribution I made to the peace process in Ireland, which has been one of the highly successful examples of the cessation of an armed conflict and the resumption of peaceful dialogue. Now, can I see the first slide? Because it might be I might refer to some of the dramatis personae in it. I'll mark the slide number 1 if it's possible. It doesn't matter. I'll continue to speak while we see the first slide. Give me a clue when it comes up. But the key to this is the troubles, as the recent troubles in Ireland, which stretched from the 1960s to the turn of the century, about 40 years. Now, in that course of events, some 3,500 people lost their lives. Now, you might think 3,500 people, given this current troubled Europe that we live in, is pretty small beer. I mean, doesn't compare with what's happening in Ukraine. It doesn't compare with what's happening in the Gaza Strip. But nonetheless, 3,500 deaths, fatalities, and thousands of bombings and atrocities in a developed Western European democracy, because Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is a significant thing. It was one of the enduring internecine conflicts in the European continent. So over that period of 40 years, there was about 1,000 British soldiers died, just about 1,200 civilians, and some hundreds of the paramilitaries on both sides of the divide. The divide is usually thought of between the Nationalist Republican IRA, provisional IRA, and on the other side, the Ulster Volunteer Force, a force of paramilitary loyalists who swore allegiance to the Crown and felt that the security forces weren't doing an effective enough job. So that was the armed conflict that took place in Ireland. Are we close to getting the slide up? Because it would be handy to have it. Mark, the slide, is it coming?
Hold on 1 second. Keep
yeah, well, right, I'll get, in that case, I'll paint some picture of the history of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's a very unusual place. It was the part of the plantation, whereby James the Sixth of Scotland, the first of England and Northern Ireland, or Ireland, planted a whole generation of Scots Presbyterians in the north of Ireland. James was on a mission to create a united kingdom about 100 years before it was actually created. He employed all sorts of devices. He was an extremely learned, extremely clever king. He'd been King of Scotland for 30 years before he became King of England. He was probably the wisest, certainly the best educated king that England ever had. And he embarked on a propaganda and effective diplomatic campaign to unify the kingdoms of which he was the monarch. In Scotland, for example, the Shakespeare play Macbeth is part of that unification effort. The Union flag, the Union Jack, as it's sometimes misnamed, is also part of that. That came about because of a competition that James held to see how you could combine the national flags of Ireland, Scotland and England. And in Ireland, he decided a much more draconian policy, as I'm afraid the English kings have tended to do over the centuries, and that was he transported tens of thousands of Scots Presbyterians into an almost totally Catholic country of the north of Ireland. Now that, as you might expect, and as we think of more recent events in other countries, created a certain amount of civic tension. And that culminated at the end of the 17th century in the dynastic wars, which saw his grandson James II unseated by Prince William of Orange, and William and Mary then became the king and queen of England, Scotland and Ireland. The famous climactic battle was the Battle of the Boyne of 1690, where James's forces were routed. Or as the songs go, and I'm going to talk about songs in a second, King James and all his rebel band marched up to Bishopsgate. This commemorates when he tried to get into the city of Londonderry and the Protestant apprentice boys shut the gates on a Catholic king. Now this is quite remarkable, because how many 17th century battles are part of the current political dialogue in any society? But the Boyne 1690 you'll find adorned in murals, in banners across Northern Ireland, because it's still remembered as the decisive battle which settled the Protestant ascendancy. Now, of course, history is never even, and people think, well, that conflict between Catholic nationalists and Protestant Unionists was essentially set in that time and has been the same ever since. That's not true. A century after the Battle of the Boyne, there was a phenomenon called the United Irishmen, which was led by a Protestant called Wolfe Tone, who managed to unite Scots Presbyterians and Catholic Irish from the south of Ireland on their joint endeavour to unseat the Anglican supremacy. In other words, both communities were being oppressed by the Anglican supremacy, the establishment of England. Both were dispossessed in terms of land holdings, both weren't allowed to vote. There was a parliament in Ireland at that stage, and therefore he managed to forge an alliance between the Protestant Presbyterian Northern Irish and the Catholic Irish peasants in Mayo. Indeed, he went to France to seek the help of Napoleon Bonaparte, who he suggested should invade Ireland. Unfortunately, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the rising star of the French Revolution at the time, because we're talking about the year 1798, decided to invade Egypt instead of Ireland. It is arguable, and he sent a dilettante cavalry officer called General Humber instead. But it's arguable if Napoleon had decided to invade Ireland, then he would never have faced his Waterloo some years later, because it's arguable a general like Napoleon would have been successful because of the situation in Ireland. Mind you, if he hadn't gone to Egypt, he wouldn't have discovered the Rosetta Stone and would know nothing whatsoever about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and things. So there was a benefit in invading Egypt. But nonetheless, it was a decisive moment when Wolfe Tone, the leader of the United Irishmen, failed to persuade the French to invade Ireland, and instead Bonaparte decided to invade. Now, the recriminations from that failed adventure, because General Cornwallis, who some of you will remember surrendered Georgetown to the American revolutionists some 20 years earlier, got a narrow escape in losing Ireland as well as America, and he strung up the Scots Presbyterians and he strung up the Irish Catholics, so they were all put to the gibbet and hanged, drawn and quartered, which understandably caused a fair amount of recrimination between the Presbyterians and the Catholics, blaming each other for who didn't do what at what time and for the failure of the revolution. So it resettled the divide. And future Peel in particular, as Prime Minister, decided to consolidate that cleavage by restoring rights to Presbyterians in Northern Ireland, but continued to disenfranchise Catholics. And so it was set in, once again, the division in Northern Irish society. A division which remained through Irish independence of 1922, when 6 counties, the 6 counties of Ulster, were separated from the settlement and stayed part of the United Kingdom, albeit with their own parliament. So, in the words of another song, this island of ours, lads, has long been half free. 6 counties still suffer John Bull's tyranny. Now, I mention some songs because the impact of this divided society generated a huge wealth of songs, of culture, of folklore, of myths on either side of the divide. There have been PhDs written and achieved in looking just at the cultural influence of these songs. And some of the songs are absolutely magnificent. If the subject matter were not so intolerant and discriminatory, we'd all gladly join in the splendid ballads and songs and vibrant marching tunes that were produced by this conflict in Ulster. And so it was into that environment, that entrenched environment of division, of civil conflict, of bombings, of 3,500 people dead, that they managed in the Belfast Agreement of 1998 to carve out a peace. But the peace did not result in the resumption of civic democratic processes in Northern Ireland. That came after the St Andrews Agreement of 2006. Now, if we do get to this slide, it would be really, really good. Anyway, look, I'll just have to describe you what this slide shows. I was invited by the then First Minister, the Reverend Ian Paisley, and the Deputy First Minister, Martin McGuinness, to address the newly formed administration. Because after all of these hundreds of years of conflict, of the disenfranchisement of the Catholic community in Northern Ireland, I don't know, you want to pass it round, Taz? Maybe pass it round. Well, pass it there, somebody can have a look at it. But anyway, look, they managed to come to this settlement, the St Andrews Agreement, whereby they formed a joint administration between the Democratic Unionist Party, led by the redoubtable Reverend Ian Paisley, and Sinn Féin, whose deputy leader was Martin McGuinness. Now, 2 more disparate characters you could never have imagined. The reason they asked me to come across to Ireland to help to maintain their administration was I'm a Scots Presbyterian, therefore I'm the same religion as the Reverend Ian Paisley, albeit in somewhat more moderate form. And I'm also a Scottish nationalist, which meant I had a natural sympathy to Irish nationalism and the politics of Martin McGuinness. It was, as you like, I had a foot in both camps, and therefore was trusted, unwisely or not, by both the Reverend Paisley and Martin McGuinness. So I made a speech in the Northern Ireland Parliament. It was a very careful speech, because like this audience, but the right number of people here, of all different parts, anyone who could have walked out at any moment. So it was a carefully crafted speech about Scotland and Northern Ireland, designed to offend nobody. And after the speech was judged to be a success because nobody walked out, we went for a cultural interchange in the Great Hall of Stormont. And that is what is on a photograph, which I'm now going to describe to you. The photograph has the Reverend Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, formerly of the IRA, beating a drum, which I am holding. This is not an ordinary drum, it's a Lambeg drum. It's the largest percussion instrument in Europe. It was brought to Ireland by William of Orange back in 1690 in somewhat smaller form, and it's the drum that's used in Protestant marches in Northern Ireland. So long before you can hear the flute music, you can hear a bang, bang, bang of this incredible drum. So we're sitting in the Great Hall of Stormont. Martin McGuinness was on my left, Ian Paisley was on my right. And I'm looking, and what they had was a celebration of the different strands of Northern Irish culture. So a pipe band marched through, and then they were followed by a flute band, the pipe band representing Gaelic Ireland, Nationalist Ireland, the flute band representing Protestant Ulster. And so the whole thing was a melange of 2 different cultures. And I'm looking at this massive drum, and I said to Mr. McGuinness, I don't suppose you've ever been close to one of these things before. And he says the nearest I've been to a Lamberg drum is 100 yards demonstrating, because the Lamberg drum used to lead processions of Protestant marchers through Catholic areas. Boom, boom. And then I said to Big Ian Paisley, you know, Ian, it would be a significant thing if we could get our photograph taken, me, you and Martin, with the Lamberg drum. So there was then a consultation between their PR people, which lasted about 20 minutes, and eventually both of them decided that they would go ahead. Now, I know I notice here in Berlin, we say, what is all that fuss about a photo? Well, after a conflict between De Valera and Winston Churchill towards the end of the Second World War, the British ambassador said to Churchill, he said, you've got to remember, Prime Minister, that words make history in Ireland. And if words make history, symbols can make breakthroughs. And what was in this photograph, a photograph that appeared on every single front page of every single Irish newspaper, north and south. In fact, the only place this photograph has not appeared is here. Well, as you can see, folks, the handsome chap in the middle, that's me. The big guy on the right, then over 80 years old, was Ian Paisley, and the chap on your left here is the former IRA commander, Martin McGuinness. That photo, not just that photo, but that photo and the parity of esteem of the two different strands of culture of the statelet of Northern Ireland was what managed to help bridge the divide. Now, I offer just three other aspects of evidence for this. In negotiating the St Andrews Agreement, which I was before I was First Minister, but because the agreement was in Scotland, I had some small part in. One of the most positive forces in terms of bringing about an agreement was the Loyalists and Republican prisoners in the Maze prison in Belfast and Longkesh. Now, you may think that's kind of paradoxical, or you may not, that the prisoners, people who were convicted of acts of violence and murder, were the most supportive of a peace process. You might think it's quite rational. If you're facing a 30-year sentence, you might be interested in a process that will reduce that sentence or have you released. But nonetheless, given the entrenched views, if you remember, some 20 years before, Bobby Sands starved himself to death as a member of Parliament in that prison. So you'd have to expect that the people on both sides of that divide were committed to their causes. I think one of the reasons that happened is in the 1990s an experiment took place in the Maze prison whereby Loyalist prisoners were introduced to a course on Irish history from a nationalist perspective, and nationalist prisoners were introduced to a course in Irish history from a Protestant perspective. Now, I'm not saying that any single course, apart from this one, of course, can change the course of history. But nonetheless, I was told by a gentleman called David Irvin, who was an interesting character in 2007, where he tragically died at a young age, because he was a Protestant paramilitary who was successfully engaging in the democratic process that was starting, a very visionary individual. Now, he told me that was influential, and I believe him because he was there, and he was a living example of somebody who'd been a paramilitary operator who was looking forward to engagement in a political process successfully. And his sister, to this day, runs a course in East Belfast, which is the heartland of Protestant Ulster, on the Irish language, which is an indication that that course and action was highly significant. Does the parity of esteem nominally inevitably solve civic conflict? The answer is no. Other things have to come into place as well. Society has to want to end killing and suffering and division and embrace a new reality. But is it an essential prerequisite of ending a civil conflict? I think it absolutely is. It hasn't always been plain sailing in the last 17 years since the St Andrews Agreement and since I spoke with the Paisley and McGuinness and Stormont. And indeed, the Irish government, the Northern Irish government administration was suspended about the Irish Language Act because of the failure to carry forward giving parity to the Irish language in Ulster. However, a solution has been found, the Assembly has resumed, and again there is a power-sharing agreement in Ireland. My submission is that cultural influences, the understanding of history and distinctiveness, is an essential prerequisite to long-term settlement of civic disputes. I was speaking last night to somebody who's very, very adept in the settlement of disputes in the Middle East. And I was pondering of how many children in Gaza have ever heard history taught from a Jewish perspective, and how many Jewish children have ever had history taught from a Palestinian perspective. Because without that understanding, without the empathy, and the last thing I'll say before I give way to my much more knowledgeable colleague, is that Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley are examples that, as we'd say, as my granda used to say, there is no such thing as a lost soul. Nothing about their early careers would have told you that they would become peacemakers. Reverend Ian Paisley was a fire and brimstone preacher. He sent lots of people to hell metaphorically in his sermons. Martin McGuinness sent lots of people to hell physically as an IRA commander. There was nothing about either of their backgrounds which would tell you that in 2007 they were the right people to make peace. But they were, because both of them possessed a quality which is very rare but very important. Both of them, and I knew them both extremely well, both of them possessed empathy. That is the ability to see the world from the other person's point of view. And it was that empathy, as well as no little courage and resolve, which carried Northern Ireland from where it was to where it is now, which is not a perfect society, but is one where peace still reigns as a result of parity of esteem and the mutual respect of different cultures. Thank you very much.